Hello horror hounds, welcome to my horror house. With the release of Halloween Ends and that particular film cycle, we now find ourselves in the onerous position of having 4 distinct Michael Myers Halloween timelines. I thought it would be fun to have a look at each one, look at the strengths and weaknesses of each, and use actual science to determine which of them is the best. We're going to get to the exciting stats part of the video later on, but let's just talk about the timelines themselves, and I'll give you my personal view of each before we get into the objective science of it all. The first timeline we all had chronologically, I'm going to refer to in shorthand as the Thorn timeline. That includes Halloween 1978, Halloween 2, Halloween 4, The Return, and then 5, The Revenge of, and finally Halloween 6, The Curse of Michael Myers. The strengths of this timeline, first and foremost, front and centre, Donald Pleasence, Dr. Loomis, the absolute figurehead of the Halloween franchise. Jamie Lee Curtis has done a fantastic job over the last few years of positioning herself as the masthead, the figurehead of the Halloween franchise. But lest we forget, for the longest time, as the gents over at Frightfully Forgotten quite so accurately put it, the Van Helsing to Michael Myers Dracula was Dr. Loomis, and he was the value, the heart, the soul of so much of what people loved about the Halloween franchise, and that's what, for my money, makes the Thorn timeline particularly strong. It doubles down really heavily on something that I don't like in Halloween 2, which is the familial connection to Michael. So they have to sort of double down on that when Jamie Lee didn't return with the niece, and then sort of quadruple down in Halloween 6 with Michael going after a baby, which is quite the indignity, I feel, for such an iconic slasher to be running around abjectly failing to kill a vulnerable baby. Next up, we have what I will refer to as the sister timeline, which was the first time the Halloween franchise decided to scrap some, but not all, of the movies that came previously, and that kept Halloween 78, it kept Halloween 2, and then jumped straight onto Halloween H20, and should have stopped there, but unfortunately continued onto the awful Halloween Resurrection, which destroyed everything and necessitated an absolute complete reboot, which leads us to the Rob Zombie timeline. Rob Zombie's Halloween and Rob Zombie's Halloween 2. Its own thing. So much has been said about the Rob Zombie movies, so much hate thrown at it. Occasionally you'll have people coming out of the woodwork saying, you know what, actually there's a lot to like in here. I myself have personally always championed the Rob Zombie movies. They're in a little bubble all of their own, a law unto themselves. They're the only timeline under consideration here that don't lean on John Carpenter's excellent originals, a crutch springboard, for good or ill. And after that was done, again, some may say that Rob Zombie's Halloween 2 so crashed the car that yet another reboot or reconfiguration was in order. In steps David Gordon Green and does what they did with the sister timeline. We'll call this the David Gordon Green timeline, and said everything's off the table except for John Carpenter's Halloween. And so this timeline is Halloween 78, Halloween 2018, Halloween Kills, and Halloween Ends. The strength of that timeline is that it does lean so heavily on John Carpenter's original, which, let's make no bones about it, out of all of the movies under consideration, is the best of all of them. It is the jewel in the crown, and it is no wonder that so many, all in fact other than the Rob Zombie timeline, harken back to it, and some of them harken back to it so strongly. I think after the original, this particular timeline started out strong, if not amazing, with Halloween 2018, and then for me personally quickly went off the rails with Kills and Ends which are so disparate tonally that if you watch this timeline, these four movies back to back, it doesn't feel like a cohesive whole. I know there are people who would completely disagree with me on that point and say, well, no, this is the story of the town and this and the infestation of evil and what it does. And sure, if it's there and you can see it in there and you can enjoy that, go for it. Take your enjoyment and run with it, and don't let anyone tell you you're wrong. It's not for me. But what does the science say? What I've done is I've taken the IMDb user scores for all of these films, and I've also looked in a separate column at the Rotten Tomato audience scores, not the critic scores, for all of these films. I've added them up and divided them by the number of films in the timeline. So for the Thorn timeline, I've added up all the IMDb scores, then divided that total by 5, because that's the number of films in that particular timeline. So the Rob Zombie scores, you add the two together and divide them by 2, and compared all of those outcomes. And what you get, and I appreciate the David Gordon Green movies exist in what I call a post-Zack Snyder world, which is a world where people will come into these sites and review bomb either up or down, or get very invested on their team winning the argument of which is the best art, which is utterly ridiculous. But I don't know how much that will necessarily have skewed the scores or not, but these are the indicators that we've got to go on, and the outcome is, to my mind, quite surprising. For both sites, both IMDb and Rotten Tomatoes, the popularity of the four various Michael Myers timelines is exactly the same. In last place, it won't surprise anyone to learn, comes the Rob Zombie timeline with 5.4 on IMDb and 51.5 on Rotten Tomatoes. Next up is The Thorn, 5.92 on IMDb, 55.6 on Rotten Tomatoes. Then just above that, the sister timeline, 5.975 on IMDb and 56.5 on Rotten Tomatoes. And not too far ahead on IMDb, 6.2, but way out in the lead in Rotten Tomatoes, 70.75 is the David Gordon Green, the latest timeline. Huge popular groundswell in favour of the David Gordon Green timeline at the moment. Not my personal favourite, not by a long shot. What I did find interesting is how the sister timeline would fare without Resurrection, because that is an absolute anchor weighing down the average score of that timeline, and it is perhaps a lesson of quitting while the quitting is good, because without Resurrection to fudge that timeline's average, it actually comes out on top on the IMDb scores, not on Rotten Tomatoes. David Gordon Green still wins out as the victorious timeline against the sister timeline, even without Resurrection on the Rotten Tomatoes timeline. But in IMDb, the sister timeline, the trilogy of Halloween, 78, Halloween 2, and H20, comes out on top, which doesn't surprise me. I have a lot of regard for H20. I saw it at the cinema. I think David Gordon Green's Halloween 2018 and various offshoots of that get a lot of credit for doing exactly the same kind of things that were happening in H20. Weirdly, to my mind, David Gordon Green's movies are a weird mashup of H20 and the Rob Zombie movies. One thing that I was also conscious of is that the Rob Zombie timeline does not have that crutch of John Carpenter's original movie to lean on. It is by far the highest scoring of any of these movies on IMDb and Rotten Tomatoes. So just out of perverse curiosity, I decided to have a look at and see what would happen to the Rob Zombie score if it also had a movie in it, just A mythical movie that had the same score as John Carpenter's 78 to bump up its average. It's still behind David Gordon Green on Rotten Tomatoes, but strangely enough, on IMDb, if there were a mythical third movie, say Rob Zombie's movies had continued on from John Carpenter's original, and we can include that score in this little timeline, it would pretty much have equaled the score of David Gordon Green's timeline, which I find extremely interesting. I'm not a massive stats man, so that's as much as I'm going to go into the figures. I was surprised by that. Maybe I shouldn't have been. An awful lot of people are really digging the David Gordon Green timeline. It's just not for me, which is my personal favourite. Regulars to the channel will know that a number of years ago I did a video championing Rob Zombie's 1 and 2. I think as a timeline, it's the most consistent. It goes crazier, more supernatural, more weird, more into Michael's head in the second movie. It expands out into weird visual places that you wouldn't expect from the first movie, but they are certainly of a piece. I think you can watch his two movies back to back and it tells a really nice story. If you're on board with it, you will really dig it. Every other timeline has got its ups and downs. The Thorn timeline, I've got an awful lot of time for. I personally don't think Halloween 2 is a particularly strong movie in the franchise. It's a little bit more of the same. It's really neat that it continued over onto the same night. It's not necessarily quite so neat that the Friday the 13th effect meant that John Carpenter came in and sort of tinkered with we'll let this other guy direct it, but no, I'll come in and change it. We need some more inserts, we need some more gore, we need some more blood. Michael's a bit stiff in Halloween 2, and I also think the Sister Angle is a little bit stupid. But taken as a whole, the Thorn trilogy, is dealt a few bum cards. It's dealt the relation card in Halloween 2, which it picks up and sort of has to run with and develop in 4, and I think does wonderfully well. I think Danielle Harris is an amazing addition to that particular timeline. That film ends with everything coming cyclical, and ideally perhaps could have ended there, because 5 then kind of has to fudge things and then really taints the well at the end of that, with Michael getting bust out of jail and the tattoo on his arm that's not explained at all, leaving 6 to pick up all of these really weird pieces and ultimately having to go to some very, very strange places to try and do it. After that, the sister timeline, look, I'm a big fan of H20 and it should have stopped there. Halloween Resurrection will always taint that timeline for me, but my overriding feeling coming out of Halloween Ends recently was, well, at least Halloween Resurrection had Michael Myers in it for a Michael Myers movie. And the David Gordon Green, time will tell whether those scores jink up or down or move, or whether they've settled there and people have spoken with their keyboards and with their money, and that this is the most popular timeline. If it is, that puts the people who still own the property in a very strange position, because they are going to ultimately have to completely reboot, I think, and that didn't work out so well, really, fan reception wise for Rob Zombie. But I personally don't see now how you could possibly wipe out all of these movies again and start again and say, yeah, except Halloween 78 definitely happened. Very strange times ahead for the Halloween franchise. They are absolutely not going to go on with another killer infected by evil taking on the mantle of Michael Myers. They're not going to do a full-on Friday the 13th, A New Beginning. If they're going to make a Halloween movie, Michael Myers is going to have to be in it, which means that David Gordon Green's movies are going to have to not exist in a 5th and a brand new Halloween Michael Myers timeline. Which is your favourite timeline? Please let me know. I know all of them have their strengths and weaknesses. If I had to plump for one, I'd probably say Thorn, to be perfectly honest, because I wouldn't want to lose 4. And Resurrection is such a stinker. If Resurrection didn't exist, I'd choose the sister timeline all day long. Ultimately, if I feel like I want to watch something pretty fucking nasty in the Halloween universe, I'll sit down and watch Rob Zombie's movies. They are brutal. If I then want to pick and choose, I think in my head what I will do is work out some kind of flubberdy-jubbedy way of keeping Halloween 4 in with 1, 2, 4 and then jump to age 20. But don't ever rule out the power of Donald Pleasance as Dr. Loomis in those Thorn movies. And don't ever forget that for the longest time, no matter how much we talk about now or are being guided towards talking about Laurie Strode's legacy as a character and this and that and the other, and I don't begrudge Jamie Lee her time in the sun at all, because I freaking love Jamie Lee Curtis, but let us never forget Donald Pleasance, the captain that kept the ship afloat for the longest time. I salute you.
I bid you welcome.
I welcome you to my house.
Welcome to my house.
Welcome to my home.